Hello and very welcome to this webinar on the conflict situation in Georgia, organized by the Stockholm Centre for Eastern European Studies. This center was established earlier this year. It is financed by the Swedish government and located at the Swedish Institute for Foreign Affairs, UI, but it is independent. My name is Jon Sackau. I work as an analyst at the center, and I will moderate today's discussion, which is based on a new report on Georgia from the center. This report is part of a report series on human rights and security in Eastern Europe. The reports in the series have been published this year and are basically all about different aspects of the so-called protracted conflicts in Eastern Europe. So far, 6 reports have been published. 3 are on Ukraine, on human rights violations in Eastern Donbass, on prisoners as political commodities in the same area, and on the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission. We also have a report on Moldova regarding the so-called Transnistrian conflict. And just recently, we published 2 more comparative reports on the protracted conflicts, including one by myself. These reports, as well as several recorded webinars about them, can be found online at ui.se. Please have a look there if you haven't already. Today, we're very happy to take a closer look at Georgia, a country in the South Caucasus with several ethnic minorities and Russia as a large neighbor in the north. It is now close to 30 years since the Soviet Union dissolved and Georgia regained its independence. For almost as long, Georgia has been burdened by conflict, among other things, meaning that the central government does not control all of the country's territory. Over time, there have been different conflict phases, including with more large-scale hostilities in the early 1990s, which was a time of turbulence in Georgian politics. And then again in August 2008, which saw a significant military intervention from the Russian armed forces. This was then followed by a Russian recognition of the so-called Republic of Abkhazia and Republic of South Ossetia as independent states. But what does such a short description actually mean? What kind of conflict or conflicts are we talking about? Why is conflict resolution so hard? What are the wider policy implications, including for European security and the normative European security order? And what could be done for conflict management, or ideally, conflict resolution and restored respect for international law and fundamental OSCE principles and commitments, such as respect for Georgia's sovereignty and territorial integrity? These and other issues will be discussed today. We're very happy to have with us Diana Janse, the author of the report on Georgia that the center has just published. Georgia and the Russian Aggression is its title. Diana is a senior fellow at Stockholm Free World Forum, a Swedish foreign and security policy-oriented think tank. She has previously served in a number of important positions for the Swedish Ministry of Affairs, including as Sweden's ambassador to Georgia between 2010 and 2014. As commentator and discussant, we are very happy to have Tornike Gordadze, senior fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, with us. Up until 2012, Tornike was a Georgian government official serving as Deputy Foreign Minister in charge of relations with the European Union, and also as State Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic integration. Very welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
The outline of the discussion is that we will have introductory remarks by Diana on some of the key points from her report. Tornike will then provide some comments and reflections on this. After that, we will have a discussion and go a bit deeper into the issues that you bring up, so you don't need to say everything directly. And after that, we will open the floor for questions and comments from the audience. And those of you who participate via Zoom, you will be able to ask questions through the Q&A function down in the center of your screens. And if you're watching our live stream on Facebook, please use the comment field there. Please post your full name and affiliation if you have one. I will then gather the questions and bring them into the discussion. I should also add that this webinar is being recorded and will be available to watch also later at the UI website, ui.se. And with this introduction, I am happy to give the screen to Diana Janse. Please.
Thank you very much, Jan. And good day to you all. It's a pleasure being here today and just give a few remarks on my findings in the report that I've written. Well, the conflicts in Georgia are nothing new. As you mentioned in the beginning, it's been going on for the 30 years, for the full time of Georgia's regained independence. But I think one important finding is that the international response to Georgia's conflict regions and Georgian conflict from the start. And over all these 30 years, we have seen Russia's very strong hand in these conflicts, and Russia's influence and leverage in the non-government controlled areas have been amplified by the various monitoring and peacekeeping arrangements that have been put there from the very start in the early 90s. And this influence and leverage from the Russian side has been instrumentalized for Russia's own geopolitical agenda. And in essence, this can be boiled down to impede Georgia's escape from the Russian sphere of influence, to prevent Georgia from making its own security policy choices, such as gaining NATO or EU membership, and to maintain a Russian military foothold in the region. And despite this very obvious influence and leverage and role that Russia has played in these conflicts, Russia's gotten away with playing mediator and peacekeeper at the same time, while also being party to these conflicts and having their own interest, as I mentioned. And this has largely been ignored or played down. And there has also been, Russia has gotten away with its own narrative of its role or its non-role in these conflicts. Instead, we have had a narrative that was very dominant up to the August War in 2008, and that was that this conflict was only a conflict between the central government run by a majority of ethnic Georgians and the ethnic minorities in Abkhazia and in Tskhinvali region. So though this conflict aspect is still there for sure, or have been there for sure, but it's not, it's only a smaller part of the grander scheme. And I would also say that despite plenty of Georgian government initiatives in order to bridge these or heal these conflicts, to bridge this sort of confidence or to address these issues and to engage in confidence building measures in various ways by Russia's actions. So after, I think also up to the the 2008 August War, though there were plenty of Russian action very much targeted against Georgia, and that had very little to do with actually the situation in the Tskhinvali region or in Abkhazia, but it was a Russian-Georgian aspect to this was played down. And then after the war, once we had a 6-point agreement, Russia got away with not implementing what it promised to deliver on. and this pattern has continued, and even more so when Russia acknowledged these, or recognized is a word, recognizes non-government controlled areas as independent states. Well, it has.
Diana, sorry to interrupt. You're breaking up a little bit.
Okay. Yeah.
Is there any chance you could adjust the computer maybe, or try another network or so?
Well, I have a full coverage here, but I had the same problem when I listened to you. You were also cracking up now and then. So I'm afraid there is not much I can do. I have full coverage on my computer.
Okay, let's try. If need be, you can try with switching off the camera to use less bandwidth. But let's give it another try. Please go on. Now you seem completely frozen. Maybe switch off the camera, and we could try it with just your voice.
No.
Diana, can you hear me? Let's see if we can get Diana back on track. Maybe in the meantime, Tornike Godadze,
Yes.
could you step in and give some comments and thoughts on what Diana has just said, and maybe you would want to add something from your perspective as well. And then we can see if Diana can come back in.
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation, and I think what you are doing is extremely useful, because the conflict between Georgia and Russia was becoming in the last years maybe less discussed and less actively themes of discussion on the international scene. And thank you for bringing back this very important conflict back. This conflict is important, not because just myself, I'm Georgian and I was born in Georgia and I feel very much concerned, but when you see historically, I mean, in the recent history, post-Soviet history, Georgia was the war in Georgia, and the war between Russia and Georgia was the first conflict where Russia used openly intervened and violated internationally recognized borders. And this was the first conflict after the war in Afghanistan. I mean, after Georgia, there was Ukraine, there was Syria. So we see this series of internationally waged wars by Russia, and it started with Georgia. There was a conflict also in Chechnya before Georgia, but Chechnya is still considered and was considered as a part by international law, as a part of Russian Federation. So Georgia was the first country, became the victim of Russia's aggressive behavior on international scene. And when I mean aggressive behavior, I mean military intervention on the Georgian territory. And I remember how big was the reaction inside the Russian society, how the government tried to mobilize Russian opinion, saying that we won the war. It's the first war we won after the defeat in Cold War. It was kind of reversal of what happened during the Cold War, after the Cold War and the defeat of the Soviet Union. And then Putin understood also how important was for him to wage wars, small victorious wars, in order to prolong his power. And that's why several other wars followed. And these wars also followed because the price Vladimir Putin paid for the invasion in Georgia was very limited. I don't know if you remember, but during the international discussions that followed immediately after the Russian military intervention in Georgia, there were almost no sanctions against Russia. The only tangible international consequence that Russia played was the suspension of Russian NATO Commission meetings, and also the suspension of Russia's participation in Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. But this was only for a few months. I mean, Russia didn't pay any substantial price for the war in Georgia, for the occupation of Georgia's territories of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And that's why Vladimir Putin felt empowered, and he moved forward. And this is one of the biggest mistakes of the international community, and namely of the West, who of course criticized, condemned Russia, but at the same time tried to find excuses for not going further and for not being tough with Russia. And these excuses were various. One of the excuses was, oh, maybe Georgia was too actively seeking its membership in NATO, and that's why Russia felt attacked. But I can remind these people who say that in the 90s, when already Russia intervened in these two breakaway regions of Georgia, there was not a hint or not any attempt of Georgia to become closer or to become member of NATO or the European Union. The conflict, as Diana says in her report, was already there in the 90s. Also, the endless discussions who opened the fire the first. At this time, in 2008, we had no knowledge and no intellectual concepts such as hybrid warfare, and the Russians were already waging very actively hybrid forms of warfare against Georgia. And what happened in the 8th of August 2008 was only one episode of the war that was already there in the territory of Georgia. Russian military, Russian intelligence services were entirely in control of these separatist groups and separatist governments. Russia have illegally distributed Russian passports to all the population of remaining population of Abkhazia and South Ossetia after the expulsion of Georgians, and Russia attacked. There was several study cases of cyber attacks against Georgia before Russia militarily invaded Georgian territory in August 2008. So all these components of hybrid warfare were already there, and that's why also this Russia-Georgia conflict is very important, because Georgia was the playground of experimentation of all these practices. And at this time, we had no knowledge of these practices, and we had even not a term to call this kind of Russian behavior, and this is also why Georgia-Russia conflict is very important. Georgia, and the absence of reactions or of lessons learned from this conflict led to a war in Ukraine. If Western reaction was really strong after Russia's occupation of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. I remember at this time we were negotiating association agreement with the European Union, and we were fighting with the European Union to use the term occupation, military occupation, when we were discussing about Abkhazia and South Ossetia. There was not a consensus inside European Union among the 27 or 28 members at this time of the European Union to use the term occupation. And some of the skeptics were telling us, no, we should not use the term occupation because it will upset Russia even more. So this attitude of appeasing Russia, I think, at least partially, is responsible for what's happened later on in Ukraine, because there were no lessons learned from the conflict in Georgia, and Russia reused the same tactics with even more means, military means, than what they did in Georgia. Can you hear me? Because I don't see. Hello?
Yes,
Yes.
we can hear you fine. And
Yeah.
Yeah, it's cracking up occasionally, but yes, we can hear you.
Okay,
but
so
maybe Diana or
let's-
Tornike, please finish if you had
no, I
something
can
more.
come back later.
Yeah.
So,
Then we get back to Diana and give.
Yes.
Yeah, of course.
I
of
can
course.
definitely tag on to where Tornike, because for this for the the 2008 war, and I would add, but we're paying the price now, because just as Tornike said, what we saw then, since it came with no price for Russia, we'd seen the continuation of it. You mentioned Syria, Tornike, and Crimea,
Right.
and you have Eastern Ukraine, but you can add on to that. You can how has tried to emerge the migration crisis at the Polish border, etc., etc. It is all patterns in the same. So there are all consequences of I would say of the 2008 war, that it didn't have a significant political cost, economic cost, or military cost. And Russia will therefore, and that's my point also in the report, that's the conflict in Georgia. It's not it's a European security and stability issue, and therefore, even though I know the world is a turbulent place, and there are many crises that are asked for the West's attention, but I think this is a strong reason for bringing Georgia back to the international agenda, because it sort of have had other consequences, and it sort of starts there, and I think if we really are serious with defending a national order, well, then this is indeed not Georgia's problem. It's also our deep concern.
Thank you. I think maybe picking up on something you said, Diana, about the Russian role and behavior in Georgia before the 2008 war. You spoke about the monitoring and peacekeeping arrangements and
Yes.
indicated that they were problematic. And you, Tornike, you mentioned hybrid measures, but maybe if you could explain a little bit what these peacekeeping and negotiation formats were, and in what sense they were problematic already before 2008.
Well, in Abkhazia, the first ceasefire agreement that was reached, it was well, first. It came.
You're breaking
with,
up, Diana. Maybe switch off.
Okay.
Maybe switch off your camera.
Absolutely, I will do that. Hang on. So can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, in the first peacekeeping arrangement that was made in Abkhazia, there was a deployment of a peacekeeping force from the Commonwealth to comply with this first agreement that was put in place between the government in Tbilisi and in Sukhumi. But in reality, it was never, first this CIS peacekeeping force was never a CIS peacekeeping force, it was a Russian force. So Russia was then, it was the peacekeeper, though it was part of the conflict, so it broke the main principle of force and the trust of both parties. So that was sort of a breach of the cardinal principles. And I think it's interesting also to reflect, this was in the early 90s. If you look at, so this was more or less handed over to Russia to deal with in its own way. And even more than that, the international community more or less Russia for each resolution, sort of also thanked for what it was doing. And I think it's interesting to see the difference between how the international community responded to the conflict in Abkhazia at the time and in Yugoslavia at the same time, where there was a completely different scale of international engagement, and while Georgia was more or less left to Russia.
Any additional?
A similar role for Russia, I would say. It was another setup. It was not the UN that were to monitor it. It was the OSCE, but again, it was a Russian joint peacekeeping force with a battalion of Russian forces and a battalion of North Ossetian forces that was in fact Russian, and a Georgian battalion, and it was all under Russian command. So Russia was and supporting the breakaway Republic of South Ossetia at the time, but also then given a role as a peacekeeper, again breaking this cardinal role of peacekeeping, namely that you need both a neutral party and someone who can be trusted by the conflicting parties.
Thank you, Diana. Tornike, you may have some additional comments, and also if maybe you could answer the question as well of what has happened since the war. You mentioned some of the presumed reasons why Russia intervened militarily in 2008, but do you think the Russian goals have been achieved in Georgia, so to speak, or what's your assessment of the situation?
Just in 1 minute, completing what Diana said about the Russian peacekeeping. Russian peacekeeping, and she describes very well that Russian peacekeeping was PIEC keeping and not PEACE keeping. It's always about keeping Russia's influence where Russia promotes its peacekeeping solutions. Even before the fall of the Soviet Union tried to promote its role in the international system as a peace promoter. It was something that was already there. And Russia, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, wanted the peacekeeping missions in Georgia, in Moldova, and in other places. But that was, in fact, Russia's attempt to keep these countries under Russia's influence. And don't forget to compare this with Russia's behavior now in Karabakh. Russian troops, Russia obtained from Armenia and Azerbaijan 2,000 military, the right to send 2,000 military in the region of Karabakh. And now Russia appears as a true patron of this Nagorno-Karabakh region, and not Armenia anymore. And Russia is promoting its own interests through the peacekeeping for missions everywhere. And also these two different treaties that were signed by Georgia and Russia about Abkhazia and South Ossetia came after Georgia's defeat. So it was more or less kind of capitulation. Georgia had no force to resist to what Russia was dictating in these treaties. And that's why Georgia accepted basically the same people who were fighting against Georgia during the Abkhaz War in 1992-1993 to give them the right to be peacekeepers, which is absolutely incredible, and because of the absence of international community in this conflict, of course. Now to your question, what happened after the war in 2008 and Russia's role? Yes, Russia Russia recognized the independence of South Ossetia and Abkhazia in order to sign the treaties with these recognized so-called states to mention and to make it legal their military presence on the territory of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. I have some friends in Abkhazia who now bitterly joke, and they said, okay, we were independent before 2008 and now we are recognized, and these two things are totally different. So now they are recognized but much less independent than before the war 2008, because the Russian military presence became extremely even more important, much more important. Russia is controlling all the borders, so-called borders of Abkhazia. The Abkhazian budget is composed by 2/3 of Russian transfers, and in South Ossetia the situation is even much worse, because in case of South Ossetia the remaining population is only about 30,000 people, and you have basically a huge Russian military base near Tskhinvali, and a few thousands of people and their families living in South Ossetia, which is totally emptied, and the population departed. So, and the control of Russia in South Ossetia is absolutely total. The local budget is composed, 96% of the local budget is direct transfers from Russia, and several years even before the war in 2008, the local government was already composed by the Russian citizens who were sent from Russia, not the Russian citizens, Ossetian citizens of Russia, but people from different parts of Russia, from Chelyabinsk, where the prime minister of South Ossetia was a person who used to be, who came from Chelyabinsk. Different ministers in this government were sent directly from Russia with no previous links with South Ossetia. So these two regions were already totally controlled by Russia. And after the war 2008, Russia entirely consolidated its control over these two territories. Russia somehow cynically tried to make these countries recognized by the international community, but only via marginal actors, like some Pacific islands, plus Nicaragua and in Venezuela, and now Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria. At the same time, Russia has no interest of involvement of any international organization in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Diana described in her report that a Russian Federation killed the two missions, one in Abkhazia, the UNAMIG mission of UN mission in Abkhazia, and the other one, OSCE mission in South Ossetia, and also the European Union monitoring mission, UMM, that was part of the agreement that was signed in 2008 between Russia and Georgia. UMM has no right, so Russia forbids UMM to go and to inspect the situation on the other side of administrative border between South Ossetia and Georgia, and Abkhazia and Georgia. So this ABL is monitored by AUMM only from the Georgian side and not from the other side. They have no right at all to see what is going on, the military buildup, etc., is going on the other side.
Thank you so much. everyone listening, please be aware of the fact that you may ask questions. If you participate via Zoom, you can ask them through the Q&A function down in the middle of the screen, or if you follow this on Facebook, you can put questions in the comment field. Please state your full name and affiliation if you have any, which of course you don't need to have. Diana, I have a question for you. You mentioned that the sort of domestic intercommunal conflicts aspects are still there somehow and still relevant. Even though you, just like Tornike, also stress Russia's role and responsibility and violations of international law and OSCE principles and commitments. But I wonder if you could say something about this internal situation, so to speak, and what is the situation like, what could be done, what should be done, how should one think about these things?
Okay, well, if I start then with the Abkhaz conflict, where this aspect, I would say, is the most relevant, point out.
Please, no camera, no camera, Diana.
Okay.
When you speak. Thank you.
Okay. Well, if I start with the Abkhaz conflict, where this aspect is the most relevant, as Tornike pointed out, in South Ossetia, you have a lot of Russian nationals that aren't even Ossetians, ethnic Ossetians that have been given a Russian passport, but are Russians that have moved there or been ordered to go there to work. And the Abkhaz were in minority. And after the war in the early 90s, a lot of ethnic Georgians, they left and are now internally displaced persons in Georgia. And well, any agreement between Sukhumi and Tbilisi on any arrangement on Abkhazia and coming to peace with Tbilisi will include a right for the refugees to return, the many ethnic Georgian, sorry, not refugees, but IDPs, to return to the Abkhaz region. Thus, again, the Abkhaz will be a minority. And there is a real fear, I think, for some, that this will make them lose all their chances to influence their However, as Tornike pointed out, this is true part already played out or is overplayed, since the Russian influence is now so heavy and so dominated, and so there is not much of an Abkhaz freedom of choice anyhow. And again, also the Abkhaz are not in a minority, as I understand today, even though any census conducted there has to be, there will be question marks around any census and circumstances. So yeah, you have to then, in order for Georgia to come to peace with this aspect of the conflict, there has to be arrangements between Sukhumi and Tbilisi on how the Abkhaz can be given a say in their local whereabouts. But how do you do that when you also have an IDP return, and the Abkhaz might end up in so you secure minority rights, but this is an aspect of the war and this is an aspect of the conflict. So how do you address this? Well, first, I think you need a lot of confidence building measures, since there is this skepsis among many ethnic Abkhaz, and they would prefer than a Russian domination, many would, before Georgia. Others would. So use confidence building measures, and I think one way of addressing it is, of course, to counter the Russian narrative on what's going on in Georgia and how life under Tbilisi control would, what it would look like. But you would also, I think what you need is people-to-people contacts to a larger extent. And I know the Georgian government has for more than a decade struggled to find ways of doing that with for instance, seeking hospital care in Tbilisi-controlled territories, etc., and how, without indirectly supporting the Abkhaz narrative of an independent Abkhazia. So, of course, there are ways of doing this. I think one of the main problems is that there is no interest from the Russian side to see this happen. Everything in Abkhazia or in Tskhinvali region. So there is no space. There is no room for maneuver or there is very little room for maneuver to build on this kind of initiatives that could heal those wounds that are still there from the war.
Thank you, Diana. Now I will also bring in some questions from those listening. And we have a related question from Heinz Sjögren on this, who wonders if by now all ethnic Georgians have been forced to leave the non-government controlled areas. And I think you both mentioned something about this, but maybe you can say something more, and also something about those ethnic Georgians who remain in these areas. We have the Gali district in Abkhazia, where many ethnic Georgians live. There's also the upper Kodori Valley in Abkhazia, and then in the Tskhinvali region, or South Ossetia, as some call it, there are ethnic Georgians left in the eastern part, in the Akhalgori Valley. How are these people treated, and what are their possibilities to travel freely to and from the government-controlled parts of Georgia? Tornike, would you start, please?
Yes, thank you. As Diana said, demography matters, and one of the objectives of these wars, I mean, different wars in the 90s and in 2008, was the ethnic cleansing, and which is something that we are not saying it's very often, but it should be always recalled that almost 250,000 Georgians left Abkhazia, and 25,000 Georgians left South Ossetia. And these people, but you have, as you are right to mention, these two small regions inside the separatist entities where Georgians still remain. Gali region, before the war, Abkhazia was composed. There was 7 districts in Abkhazia, and one of the districts was Gali's southernmost district, Gali, where 99% of the population was Georgian. So there was no mix here, and several times the Georgians left Gali region, but many of them came back, and now you have roughly half of the population of Gali district, pre-war population of Gali district, is still there. When I say half, it's all 45,000 people. And the rights of this population are today violated every day. There is literally no possibility, or it's almost impossible for them to study Georgian language at schools, which is now considered by the Abkhaz authorities as a foreign language, and in most of the schools, this language is even forbidden. Some teachers, some school directors try to keep the lessons in Georgian language, but this is becoming more and more difficult. All this population who travel, who try to cross this so-called border between Gali and Zugdidi. Zugdidi is on the side controlled by the Georgian authorities. Is extremely difficult. They are subjected to humiliations from the Russian border guards plus the Abkhaz militias, and quite often these people. There were several cases where these people were killed during their attempt to cross this border. In Tskhinvali region, the situation is complicated by the fact that the border is not clear. So if in the case of Abkhazia, there's a river that determines more or less where the ABL goes, this administrative boundary line between the rest of Georgia and Abkhazia. In case of South Ossetia, the situation is extremely vague. There are some Soviet maps that have never been really used because South Ossetia as it was part of Georgia, nobody really draw the line, and now Russia is building a state border there, and Russia decides unilaterally where the border goes, where is the border between Georgia and so-called South Ossetian Republic, and that goes through the tragedies of ordinary people. Sometimes the people, they see their lands, their houses divided into two. Sometimes families are divided, and quite often Russian authorities and Russian military use as pressure on Georgia the fact that local inhabitants are arrested for illegally crossing the state border. And then the South Ossetian government plus the Russian occupational forces are using these people who are arrested and are in custody as hostages, and then Georgia, together with some international actors, try to liberate them, and it's endless moments like this, and the situation on everyday life for these people living along these separation lines are extremely volatile and extreme. They are living in very poor conditions with their rights violated every day.
Thank you so much. I can also just add or perhaps clarify that the terminology used when talking about Georgia and the conflict situation is political, and there's no agreed language on this because there's no agreed language on who the conflict parties are, so to speak. And as you mentioned, what Russia then considers state borders of the so-called Republic of Abkhazia and so-called Republic of South Ossetia do not exist according to Tbilisi's view. De jure, according to the central government of Georgia, there is still an autonomous Republic of Abkhazia, meaning that there is a sort of administrative boundary line between this part of Georgia and the rest of Georgia. South Ossetia, on the other hand, does not exist de jure according to the central government in Tbilisi, because this was an autonomous area of the Soviet Republic of Georgia, the South Ossetian Autonomous Oblast, and that was abolished by the Georgian parliament in 1990, meaning that there is no longer any administrative boundary line around South Ossetia, which no longer exists, and instead the Georgian government talks about the Tskhinvali region, which is a sort of geographic concept that is not administrative.
Sorry.
Just to clarify, in case any of the listeners wonder why sometimes South Ossetia is used, sometimes the Tskhinvali region. Diana, would you shortly want to add something on this? Otherwise, I have a few more questions to.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I might have missed that you said it because it was cracking up a bit, but the Abkhaz so-called border has always been a bit easier to handle. So up to the 2008 war, it was the South Ossetian situation was much more fluid, with some villages controlled by Tbilisi, others by the breakaway republic, or whatever you want to call it, in Tskhinvali, and it was never very easy to mark on what was what on a map. And something I did not take up in my report, all the borderization that the FSB border guards that now control what they consider the state border of South Ossetia, they are also moving this state border at times. So you, as a Georgian living on the other side of this ABL, as the Tbilisi government prefers to call it, and the administrative boundary line, end up having one morning their orchard or their field on the side of a, and have this unstable and unsecure situation for people living in that particular region. But it is fluid, and it has been over the years.
Thank you, Diana. We're approaching the end of the webinar, but we have time for a few more questions. We have one from Per Lindberg, who wonders if there's a possibility that Russia, in the middle or long term, will fall victim to what he calls imperial overstretch. That is that the demographic and economic situation of Russia will no longer match their foreign ambitions, and that this possibly could lead even to a Russian withdrawal from Georgia. Any thoughts on that? And please be brief, a minute or so at maximum.
I don't think so, for the simple reason that this overstretch, or this stretch in Russia, this scenario would only be real if Russia were actually to pay the full price of what it was doing in Georgia and elsewhere. But as I see it, it is a low cost arrangement for us.
Tornike?
Yes, and the fact is that these Abkhazia and the former Soviet Union and near abroad is used as one of the main political arguments to consolidate power in Russia. And the nationalism, this kind of imperial nationalism, is one of the basic components of the political discourse in Russia, and not only on Putin's side. That's why it will be very difficult, and it will depend pretty much, as Diana said, on how the West will behave, and the price that Russia will have to pay for that. If there is no pressure on Russia, I mean, why the Russian authorities would abandon this militaristic and nationalist discourse? Russia decided to stay an empire, and for them, it's part of empire to keep control on the territories. At the same time, the Russian borders have never been really stable in the past. So maintaining this mythology of empire is something that is quite common in Russia. Russia has never really, even today, Russia never became a national state. And that's why this overstretching is a constant process. Sometimes some catastrophes happen, like in 1917 or 1991, but then it comes back. So this is a constant phenomenon in Russian history.
Thank you. We have one last question from the audience from Shota Gvineria from EPRC Georgia, which is a think tank, I believe. And Shota wonders about the EU's cooperation with Eastern Partnership countries on defense and security, which is something that has been discussed lately. And he wonders if the EU somehow could become a credible security player in the Black Sea region, and if any specific steps could be taken in this direction. Any thoughts on this? EU as a security and defense player in the Black Sea region and in Georgia. Could anything be done in the cooperation with Georgia? Diana, would you mind to start?
Yeah, I rather have you to start, Tornike, if you don't mind.
Well, it's not an easy question because the European Union so far has a huge problem of being a security actor in general, not only in the Black Sea region, and there is a huge debate inside the European Union how to evolve in this direction and how to promote European Union as a security actor, because we see some difficulties inside NATO, especially when it comes to Black Sea region, because we have Turkey and Romania and Bulgaria on one side, and we have some other members of the NATO who are very critical of this, and in particular of Turkey. So I have no clear answer on that. Of course, we all wish the involvement of European Union as a security actor in this region, but I think it would be more realistic if neighboring countries, bordering countries, the countries that border Black Sea, promote a different format of discussion and to promote their security together with, some of the members of NATO, and some those who are not members, like Turkey, Romania, Bulgaria on one side, Ukraine and Georgia on the other side, and plus all other stakeholders that are interested in promotion of security in this region. So far, I don't see European Union very active, but the wish would be for European Union to become more active, but I don't see how at this stage they could come in.
Okay, thank you. I think we need to wrap up.
Continue.
So
okay.
Maybe, I'll let Tornike, if you have a sort of one sentence or so as a final remark, and then Diana, you will get the last word here. In overall, sort of on Georgia and the conflict.
At the beginning, I think you are doing a great job to bring back the discussions about this so-called protracted conflicts and to attract attention of international community on that. Unfortunately, these issues became less important in the last years, maybe also because Georgian government is not active as it should be, and on the other side trying to demonstrate to the international community that they are constructive with Russia, but we don't see any clear results. So thank you, and I think these conflicts cannot remain protracted forever. We have seen that there are no such a thing as frozen conflict. This conflict can be reactivated anytime. So without efforts from the international community to solve them, definitely it will always remain as a potentially explosive and potentially dangerous for international security.
Thank you. Diana? Yeah, I think actually the last question was a good bridge to wrap up, because I think this EU role as a security provider in the Black Sea region or elsewhere in our neighborhood in the Eastern Partnership countries happen as long as a common view on Russia, but also a common view on how to respond to the challenge that Russia is today. So And here, I think at times, when at the EU's brighter moments, we managed to have a common view on Russia, but very seldom, if ever, on the response, how to actually deal with today's Russia. And try to key not only to solve Georgia's conflicts, but it's a key to European security and stability. It sort of starts and ends with our how we respond to Russia's challenging this security and stability over and over again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diana Janse and Tonike Goradze, for today's very interesting discussion, as well as to the audience for listening and contributing with very good questions. I think today's discussion underlined the importance of keeping Georgia on the international agenda, or else there is a risk for an escalation, or that these ongoing violations of international law that we see in Georgia will become permanent. And the discussion today has also made it clear that there are policy implications that go beyond Georgia. Ukraine was mentioned, Syria was mentioned, and so on. And as was also touched upon, the local population in Georgia, both in the government-controlled areas and in the non-government controlled areas, are affected by the situation. So let's not forget about them either. Those of you who have not yet read Diana Janse's report, please have a look at ui.se, where you will soon also find a recording of this discussion. On the website, you will also find plenty of other interesting reports. As I mentioned initially, the Stockholm Centre for Eastern European Studies has in the last few months published several reports that in one way or another relate to today's topic of discussion. We have 3 reports on Ukraine, 1 on Moldova, as well as 2 more comparative studies of the protracted conflicts in Eastern Europe. We have also just published a report on the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan by Dr. Stefan Meister from the German Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin. And this very interesting topic will also be discussed in a webinar the day after tomorrow on the 24th of November. You can already now register for this event at ui.se. You can also follow the center at Twitter. If you search for SCEEUS, SCEEUS, you should be able to find us, or via the website ui.se. And in the pipeline from the center is also a report on international law and accountability in the context of conflict, particularly as regards international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Again, a really warm thank you to Diana Janse and Tonike Goradze, and to everyone watching and listening. All the best from Stockholm.
Thank you very much.